They called it peace. But what Rome had really been craving was something sharper than calm: certainty. The kind of certainty that lets you walk home at night without scanning every shadow. The kind that keeps grain ships arriving on time. The kind that stops politics from turning into street fights and executions. By the time Augustus arrived, the Roman Republic had been bleeding for decades. Elections were violent, bribery was normal, rival politicians hired gangs to intimidate voters. And the most ambitious men didn't just campaign, they raised armies. Once commanders discovered their soldiers would follow them personally, not the state, the old rules started to look like suggestions. Then the crises stacked up. Civil wars, purges, dictatorship, assassination. In 44 BCE, Julius Caesar was murdered by senators who swore they were saving the Republic. Instead, they blew a hole in the center of the system, and a flood poured through it. Into that chaos stepped a teenager most Romans barely knew: Gaius Octavius, Caesar's adopted son and legal heir. He was only 18, not yet a famous general, not a legendary speaker, and not the kind of man you expect to dominate a world empire. But he had two things that mattered more than age: Caesar's name and an instinct for power that was cold, patient, and relentlessly practical. Octavian's first big lesson was brutal. You don't get to sell peace until you've survived the war. And survival, in that moment, required force. He maneuvered himself into an alliance with Mark Antony, Caesar's leading lieutenant, and Lepidus, another power broker. Together, they formed the Second Triumvirate, an emergency regime with legal cover and extraordinary authority. What followed was not peace, it was terror with paperwork. The triumvirs posted proscription lists, official notices naming enemies of the state. If your name was on the list, you were fair game. Your property could be seized, your family ruined, your death turned into revenue. It was a system that funded armies and eliminated opponents in one stroke. It also taught Rome a nightmare lesson: the law itself could become a weapon. Octavian didn't invent that tactic, Sulla had done it before, but he participated and Romans remembered. That memory would haunt him later, because one day he would claim to be the restorer of legality. To make that believable, he would need to rebrand not just the state, but himself. In 42 BCE, the triumvirs defeated Caesar's assassins, Brutus and Cassius, at Philippi. The Republic's liberators were dead. The war was supposedly over, but Rome's larger illness remained. Too many powerful men, too many armies, and no agreed way to share dominance. The triumvirs carved up the world. Antony took the east, rich provinces with ancient cities and enormous wealth. Octavian took the west, including Italy, politically volatile and packed with veterans who demanded land. Lepidus got Africa, then slowly lost influence as the other two squeezed him out. Octavian's western assignment was a trap: settle veterans, manage land seizures, calm angry Italians, and keep rivals from using the unrest against him. He learned to present himself as the man who could deliver order, even while he was still fighting to keep control. Meanwhile, Antony ruled the East with the swagger of a conqueror, and with a growing dependence on Cleopatra, the Queen of Egypt. To modernize, their alliance is romantic and dramatic. To Romans, it was politically explosive. Egypt was imaginably wealthy, and Cleopatra was a monarch, everything Romans claimed to despise. Octavian saw his opening. If the final showdown with Antony looked like another Roman civil war, the public would dread it, and the Senate would hesitate. But if the conflict could be framed as a defense of Rome against a foreign threat, it could feel like a righteous war instead of a national suicide. So Octavian did something quietly brilliant. He turned a power struggle into a morality play. He hammered the message that Antony had betrayed Roman values, that he was bewitched by an Eastern queen, that he planned to shift power away from Rome and toward Alexandria, that Rome's identity, its traditions, its religion, its dignity was at stake. This wasn't just gossip. Octavian used documents, speeches, and carefully staged outrage. He made Antony's choices look like treason, not rivalry. And when the moment came to formalize conflict, he arranged it so that war was declared on Cleopatra, not on Antony.
That mattered because it allowed Romans to tell themselves, "We are not killing our own, we are defending ourselves." In 31 BCE, the two sides met at Actium, a naval battle that became a turning point. Octavian's commander Agrippa outmaneuvered Antony's fleet. Cleopatra fled. Antony followed. The military outcome was decisive, but the political outcome was even bigger. Octavian could now claim he had ended the last threat to Roman stability. A year later, Octavian entered Egypt. Antony and Cleopatra died by suicide, and Egypt, one of the richest kingdoms on earth, became a Roman possession. But unlike other provinces, Egypt was treated as Octavian's personal domain. Its wealth and grain supply were too dangerous to leave in any senator's hands. Now Octavian stood at the top of the world. The question was, how long could he stay there without becoming Caesar? Romans had a deep political allergy to monarchy. They had expelled kings centuries earlier and built their identity on the idea that no one man should rule. Caesar had crossed too many lines too openly: dictator for life, statues, honors that looked royal, and he paid for it with knives in the Senate House. Octavian was smarter. He understood that to keep power, he had to make power look like something else. And he faced an urgent problem. Rome wasn't just emotionally exhausted, it was structurally unstable. Armies expected rewards, provinces needed reliable administration, rival elites needed a reason to stop gambling on violence. The state needed a center that wouldn't collapse every time a strong personality walked into the forum. So Octavian began building a new system, but he built it like an architect restoring an old building. From the street, it would look familiar. Inside, the load-bearing walls would be different. He started by lowering the political temperature. He talked about restoring tradition. He emphasized that the emergency years were over. He signaled that he wanted to step back from extraordinary powers. Then, in 27 BCE, he performed a carefully staged act of restraint. He publicly announced that he was returning control to the Senate and the Roman people. It sounded like a man giving up dictatorship. It sounded like the Republic coming back to life. But the moment he gave power away, the Senate begged him to take essential parts of it back. This was not a spontaneous, emotional scene. It was political choreography. Augustus received a new name, Augustus, a title with religious and moral weight, suggesting reverence rather than brute force. He also embraced a modest label, princeps, meaning first citizen, not king, not dictator, just first among equals. And that was the trapdoor. Because while the Republic's language and offices remained, Augustus began gathering the real levers of control, military command, financial authority, and political influence in ways that looked legal, traditional, and necessary. And this is where the sale of peace truly begins. Augustus didn't ask Romans to love him as a conqueror. He asked them to accept him as a solution. He implied a simple bargain. I will prevent the return of civil war. I will protect your property, your status, your streets, and your food supply. In exchange, you will let me manage the system so it cannot tear itself apart again. After a generation of bloodshed, it was a bargain many Romans were willing, sometimes eager, to accept. But a promise is not enough. Augustus needed the peace to be felt, seen, and experienced as a daily reality. The next phase of his reign was about turning the promise into proof.
To sell peace after civil war, Augustus had to do three things at once: make the streets feel safer, make the empire run more predictably, and make Romans believe they had not surrendered their identity. His genius was that he pursued all three using the same method: quiet control wrapped in familiar tradition. First, the most dangerous force in Roman politics, the army. In the late Republic, armies followed generals. That's what made civil wars possible. Augustus worked to reverse that relationship. He professionalized the legions, kept them on long-term service, and, crucially, tied their rewards to the central system he controlled. Veterans expected land or money at discharge, and Augustus made sure those benefits flowed through his authority. The message to soldiers was subtle but clear. Your future depends on stability, and stability depends on the man at the center. He also reduced the chance of rival senators building private military power.
The main legions were stationed on frontiers, not in the political heartland. Rome still fought wars, but now most fighting happened at the edges, presented as managed defense and expansion rather than civil collapse. To many Romans, that distinction mattered. Frontier war could be explained as Rome doing Rome. Civil war felt like Rome devouring itself. Second, Augustus made the state's machine run better, because peace that doesn't feed people isn't peace for long. He stabilized provincial administration so that taxation and governance became more regular. Under the old system, governors could treat provinces like personal treasure chests, extracting wealth in short bursts before their term ended. That encouraged corruption, resentment, and revolt. Augustus's approach aimed for continuity, steadier revenue, fewer shocks, and more predictable oversight. Provinces didn't suddenly become gentle places, but the empire became more governable. He understood something practical. Ordinary people rarely care about constitutional theory when their lives are unstable. But they notice when grain prices drop, when roads are safer, when local officials aren't constantly extorting them, and when the state's decisions feel consistent instead of frantic. Third, and this was the emotional heart of the sales pitch, Augustus made peace visible. He rebuilt Rome on a scale that couldn't be ignored. Temples, forums, public buildings, monuments. Stone became messaging. When you walk through a city transformed by construction, you feel a new era has arrived. Augustus famously associated himself with renewal, not just new buildings but restored ones, signaling respect for tradition. The story was, I am not destroying Rome, I am repairing it. He also used symbols that spoke directly to Roman memory. One of the most famous was the Temple of Janus, whose gates were traditionally closed in times of peace. Augustus publicized the closing of those gates as proof that the age of internal chaos had ended. Was the empire entirely without conflict? No, there were campaigns and revolts on the frontiers, but that was part of his reframing. Peace, in the Augustan sense, meant the center was stable and the violence was controlled, pushed outward, managed by the state rather than unleashed by rival Romans. Then came the Ara Pacis, the altar of peace, where peace itself is celebrated as a civic achievement, and where Augustus's family is woven into the imagery. That mattered because Augustus was not only selling calm, he was selling continuity. He wanted Romans to associate stability with his household, to feel that the future had a shape, not just a temporary pause between disasters. But monuments and armies aren't enough. After civil war, people don't just fear violence, they fear meaninglessness. They ask, what was all that suffering for? Augustus understood the power of culture as a kind of governance. Writers and poets helped frame his reign as a turning point between a broken past and a restored world. Virgil's epic tied Rome's destiny to divine purpose and implicitly connected Augustus to that destiny. Horace celebrated civic renewal. Livy told Rome's story in a way that made moral restoration feel urgent. This wasn't a modern propaganda ministry with scripts handed down line by line, but it created a cultural atmosphere where the Augustan age felt like a settlement ordained by history itself. Now comes the cleverest part of the whole system, Augustus's legal camouflage. Instead of taking one title that screamed tyrant, he collected powers that sounded republican. One of the most important was tribunician power, the authority associated with protecting the people, proposing laws, and vetoing harmful actions. It carried the scent of popular legitimacy. Another was superior command authority in key provinces, meaning that where the armies mattered most, Augustus's authority outranked everyone else's. Put together, these powers made him the ultimate decision-maker without ever calling him king. In public, the Senate still debated, magistrates still held office, elections still happened. But the game had changed. If Augustus favored a candidate, that candidate usually won. If Augustus had a policy preference, it usually became policy. The Republic's forms remained like a familiar language, comforting, traditional, Roman. Yet the system's center was now one man whose authority was everywhere and, in a sense, nowhere, because it was spread across different legal roles. And Augustus was careful with style. He rarely acted like a thunderous autocrat. He consulted, he listened, he let senators keep prestige. He avoided humiliating the elite in public, because humiliated elites plot. This wasn't kindness, it was survival strategy based on Caesar's fate. Augustus learned that if you must dominate, you do it quietly and let others feel respected. He also sold peace through morality, another powerful lever after chaos. Augustus promoted traditional Roman values: marriage, family stability, public virtue, religious observance. He restored temples and revived ceremonies. He passed laws aimed at encouraging marriage and punishing adultery, framing them as repairs to the moral fabric torn by decades of crisis. To supporters, this was a moral reset. To critics, it was intrusive and sometimes hypocritical. But politically, it served a purpose. It presented Augustus not as a warlord who won, but as a guardian cleaning up the mess. And the mess was real. Romans had watched their political culture turn into a machine that produced violence. Augustus offered a new identity. We are no longer the people of civil war. We are the people of order. Of course, peace came with costs. Political competition narrowed. Open confrontation became dangerous, not because the Senate disappeared, but because everyone knew there was now a ceiling above them. Instead of rival coalitions battling openly, conflict moved into whispers, influence, and court politics. That can reduce bloodshed, but it also changes what freedom looks like in practice. There was also the problem the Republic was never designed to solve: succession. If the state depends on one indispensable man, what happens when he dies? Augustus needed an heir, but he couldn't openly declare monarchy without smashing his own branding. The result was a long, tense effort to arrange succession through family ties, adoptions, marriages, and public honors, often marked by tragedy, scandal, and political calculation. By the time Tiberius emerged as successor, the principle had been established. Rome would continue under another first citizen, even if everyone understood what that really meant. And that is the final truth about how Augustus sold peace. He made the future dependent on the system he built, and he made that system dependent on the role he created. He didn't announce the Republic was dead. He kept the old words alive: Senate, people, elections, magistrates, while ensuring the machinery could no longer generate another civil warlord. He turned a shattered republic into an empire that could pretend it wasn't an empire. And for many Romans, the results were convincing. Streets felt safer, food supplies steadier, careers more predictable, the political temperature lower, the constant fear of another purge or another marching army reduced. Augustus didn't sell peace like a dream. He sold it like an insurance policy. Not perfect, not free, but better than the alternative everyone remembered too well. So when you hear Pax Augusta, don't imagine a world with no violence. Imagine a world where violence is controlled, redirected, and wrapped in ritual, where the center holds and the chaos of Roman-on-Roman slaughter finally stops. That is why Augustus, the quiet architect, mattered. He didn't just win the war, he redesigned the state so that the war wouldn't come back. If you enjoyed this, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the